Hello and welcome to another episode of Talk'n TRM, the podcast dedicated to travel risk management. Now, this is something slightly different because usually we would be talking to one expert, but following on from the success of our recent podcast where we were speaking to Joël Marier, we've decided to do a special podcast with two other members of that committee that helped to create 31031. The new school and youth travel standard for managing risk. So without further ado, I'd like my guests to introduce themselves. So Joël, if I could hand over to you first, please.
Thank you, Bex, for having me again on your podcast. My name is Joël Marier. I'm from Canada, and I am a coach and a consultant in the social innovation space. In the French part of Canada, where I'm based, I had a career of more than 35 years in top management positions in youth travel or youth tourism, whether was for commercial organizations, mainly for not-for-profit organizations, sometimes for charities, both in Quebec, or in the province of Ontario here in Canada, at the national level and internationally. Many years of my career I spent working for Hosteling International in Canada or abroad, and that got me to get a better sense of international realities involved in travel. And of course, in standards. The Youth Hostel Association has long history of developing standards. And so I had the privilege of learning a lot in this sector. And now I'm applying this in the social innovation space where I work with vulnerable clienteles. I coach and consult with mainly not-for-profits, sometimes governments, to implement social change for specific clienteles or other social issues, and a lot of it is involving youths. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for coming back to see us again. You were really surprised, I think, by how many downloads we got from the other one. I'll talk to everyone a bit more about why we're doing this and what to kind of expect from it. But I want to introduce you to everybody first. So, Julian, if you could please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, Bex, and thank you again for inviting myself to talk on this podcast to your wonderful listeners. So, my name is Julian Penney, and I was I guess privileged to work as part of Joël's team in the development of the 31031. And just to explain, I suppose, my journey to how I became part of Joël's team, I guess like many people who work in or around school and youth travel, it started at school. And I had a very memorable trip to some mountains in North Wales, because I'm based in the UK, as you may tell from my accent, led by our physics teacher who didn't have any real qualifications in mountaineering, but we all came back safely and had a brilliant trip. And I fell in love with the outdoors and the mountains. And then when I was at university, I volunteered to come back and help my physics teacher lead the trip more safely, having done a qualification in mountaineering while I was at university. So that's how my journey into school and youth travel happened. I suppose my love of the outdoors then perhaps inevitably led me to a career that I could do that and get paid for it. And I did so within the army. So I was in the British Army for a number of years. But part of what I did, I enjoyed mountaineering, that I got involved in leading expeditions within the military. After a few years in the army, I then left and wondered how I could still earn money by somehow being associated with the outdoors and mountains. So I ended up joining a school travel company where I ended up as operations director after 9 years in a multinational company where I was responsible for the health and safety of thousands of school children in countries all over the world, whether they be up high altitude mountains or in the jungles or in deserts. And then after that, I established my own consultancy business And we now support schools, colleges and youth groups in helping prevent incidents from happening, preparing for things if they do go wrong on a trip, and then responding to incidents. And I guess underlying all of that is a real passionate belief that the benefits of well-managed adventure and travel significantly outweigh any health and safety risks. So I was delighted to be invited to be part of the team and to bring some of that experience to the development of this standard.
Thank you so much, Julian. There's quite a lot to unpick there, isn't there? You've given me lots of food for thought to kind of get into in a bit more. I really appreciate the reflection back on the fact that actually it all starts in our youth, because I think we all can remember. I've got a particular trip to Switzerland, which is quite memorable, having been on a coach for many, many hours and various things that happened on that trip. It didn't quite drive me in the same way, but my love for travel did, to find a role in travel. And much like you, then found myself sort of working with organisations that were really looking into this space well. And I got the feeling that most companies really kind of looked after risk management and did things very well. But obviously, as time's moved on, I've discovered there's a lot of learning. And that's why these standards are so important. And again, why we're really kind of honing in on this today, slightly away from, I guess, our normal organisational conversation around travel risk management. But there's so much to learn from this standard that can be applied to both. It's a really important conversation. So, Mike, last but not least, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, Bex. Hi. Well, I always find it difficult to answer the question, what do you do? I suppose the short answer is I'm retired, but that's not particularly true. So I consider myself to be an outdoor education consultant. And in that, I'm involved with overseas expeditions, UK expeditions, but also I work with small special schools to create programs, outdoor programs for their students, which may just be on the doorstep or just in the local woods or wherever. And also I'm involved in safety management. So it's a bit of a mix, but all roads lead to Rome, in that the focal point is all about the outdoors, young people enjoying the outdoors safely, and managing and advising on safety management. So I'm also involved with the RAF Air Cadet organisation. I've been involved for over 40 years now, and until last year I was the Overseas Expeditions Advisor, which sort of fell in line with the British standard for overseas visits being created and then continued with its development, alongside the policy I created for the Air Cadet organisation. So it was a dual role, really, and the British standard helped to create the framework that now sits as the Air Cadets policy. And more recently, I've been involved with the ISO 31031 with Joël's team. I think maybe Joël can correct me, but I think it's 4 years or so that we worked on that standard, which was published last year in September. So sort of in a nutshell, that's me. And I'm sure there's lots more that would emerge from that.
And that's my job, to get all of that to emerge from that, isn't it? So our listeners know more and more about you, Mike. Thank you so, so much. So just really for everybody's benefit, because our listeners cover a broad range within travel risk management, which is exactly the idea of what our podcast is about, to really kind of express all the different avenues that this can consider. It isn't just about high-risk countries and high-risk incidences. These are things that can happen to anybody, anywhere. And it's as much about well-being and incident response as it is sort of having plans sort of for the bigger things that happen. And we bring in the sort of holistic approach around speaking to all of your available stakeholders, things, again, that are influenced from 30. So our listeners tend to be people who are running programs, but also people who are interested in just travel risk management and the wider scope. Because what's happening a lot at the moment in organisations, what is currently happening is this standard came out in 2021, and people who perhaps have a slight part of responsibility for this role, perhaps they're in travel management, perhaps they're in security management, they may even be sitting in procurement or HR, are asked to look at this standard and then sort of do something with it. So what excited us about 31 from that perspective is that actually it allows us to explore in a bit more detail some things that perhaps we don't go into so much detail in 30. And that's primarily because it's aimed at a different group of people. It's aimed at youth and school travel. So I want to really have this opportunity to kind of talk through within this podcast, perhaps some of the differences, but also some of the learnings that organisations can also have from knowing about this standard. Because again, both 30 and 31 are, I guess, lines in the sand, a benchmark of good practice that have taken a long time to create. And it's then really now what those organisations do with it to evolve it forward. So we'd like to really explore that with you today. So in the last podcast, Joël, you really kind of gave us, well, a lot of the passion that sits behind this and an incredibly inspirational story. But let's start with you, because I know you've got a couple of other things you wanted to add in. So let's start with you on this journey and talk a little bit about the why. And then Julian and Mike, I'm going to invite you into that conversation as well to really understand the importance of this. And I think, was it 7 years, Joël? Over to you.
Yes, Bex. 7 years. 7 years ago, or just a little bit more now, I read in a newspaper that a very sad story, a young 15-year-old boy participating in a group canoe trip from Toronto to Algonquin Park, 2 hours north of Toronto. The trip went bad, very bad. That young boy died during that trip, and it's not because the school did not have proper policies. They had a 54-page document at the time. And one of the things that was mentioned in there is that if you bring people near or on water, all your group must have passed their swimming test. It was not the case for all of the group, including that young man. And so it's not enough to have a policy. You need to make it, you need to implement it properly. And the policy itself has to be correctly prepared and written. I wanted to make a difference at the time, and so I didn't know about ISO all that much. I had worked with ISO standards, but I didn't know the intricacies of the organization. When I started in youth travel many years ago, I was in college. I was 18, and I volunteered at a travel club. And we would organize on a volunteer base outings, maybe a weekend to New York, maybe a week of skiing somewhere, a language school. And I, even then, at the time, I worked with governmental agencies to implement security training for volunteers to get involved. And I started a network of travel clubs, and that got me into all of this. So it's interesting to see that with this sad story, I wanted to make a difference, got involved with ISO, and Mike is right. And I had and I still have the privilege of working with these guys and just about 30 other people from around the world who brought their expertise in gathering best practices for this kind of sad story not to happen again. We will never have a completely safe environment. There's near misses, there's small incidents, there's fatalities sometimes. I'm glad that it's not, it's a rare occasion, but when it happens, it is devastating for the family, for the friends, for the school, or for the organization, and it has all kinds of consequences. So that's what got me into this, and I'm very happy that we get the opportunity to talk about the standard and how we can use it to improve the safety of participants around the world.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that additional piece of information about sort of where all of this came from. As you were talking, I was thinking about the age range of this standard and some of the kind of questions around that and how you kind of decided what what the youth and what the age group were, because it is a different targeted audience to 30, which is much more aimed at sort of what we consider adults working in an organisation and have a certain level of an understanding of their responsibilities, their own responsibilities and duty of care. And that's something quite different when it comes to youth travel. But having now begun to understand this area a little bit more, there are policies and processes in place, so much more so than there are within the organisation sector. They're still trying to get some of their stuff together, unless they're going to high risk countries, and they may have some of that stuff in place. But how do we bring this stuff to life, and because again, a policy doesn't mean anything if we're not doing anything with it. And these are some of the challenges that organisations are facing right now. And we talk about practicing, we talk about scenario training, and all those things. And I just wonder, perhaps, Julian, if you have anything to sort of help us with that as to how we bring some of this to life and face some of those challenges, that this isn't a checklist, this isn't a policy document that nobody reviews. What can we do, and what are some of the differences that we can bring across?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, one of the most important thing for keeping young people, be it students or youth on any sort of trip, keeping them safe is competent leadership. So, and that's quite well defined within the standard. We spent quite a lot of time discussing it, and I think it's quite a distinct difference to 3130, where generally you wouldn't have a leader who is responsible for the individuals who are travelling, but on a school or youth trip, of course you do, and of course competence is so important. For standards are brilliant, and of course anyone who's listening today will understand the benefit of standards and documentation and so on. But actually, more important than any of that is competent leadership in keeping people safe. And I guess competence, it can be defined in various ways, but generally it's a mix of, I guess, experience, training or qualifications, and the personal qualities of individuals. And that's not in any particular order. It's probably an equal blend of them all. And I guess those would need to be in the activities that are being done, with the environment that the activities are taking place in. They're not always higher risk or outdoor environments. In fact, some great activities can be done in very low risk settings, and actually that's really important too. But also competence in understanding the group's needs and the additional needs potentially of children. Now, all of that generally isn't necessary in the same way, I'm guessing, in 3130. Another key difference, I guess, linked to that is very much within 31031 is that there's one trip leader. And it's defined within the standard that they're the designated, I'm just reading it here, the designated individual taking lead responsibility under the direction of the trip organizer. That's a key principle within 31031. And that's one that is important, I guess, for any of the listeners to understand. School boards and other organisations who underwrite legal liability for trips or employers of youth organisations obviously have a higher duty of care over children than perhaps adult employees. And of course, competence of staff would be analysed in quite some detail before anyone was signed off to lead a trip, in terms of first aid qualifications, whether they have perhaps qualifications in activity leadership, whether there's safeguarding training that they might have needed and things. All of that sort of aspects and that blend is quite different, I think, to some other forms of travel. The safeguarding is particularly interesting. I don't know if Mike's going to talk about that, but we ended up writing a whole separate annex specifically within 31031 on safeguarding, because of course, keeping children safe from that aspect is so important as well.
Well, that's a lovely segue, Julian, to let me bring Mike into the conversation, and thank you for that, and for clearly defining some of those key differences. I think we do have a crossover, and I think actually the stakeholding piece will help with this. And I think as we get into the kind of what the young adult piece looks like, we'll have organisations resonating with us even in more detail. So, Mike, do you want to talk to us a bit more detail about that part of the process?
Yeah, about safeguarding. So, to put it into context, for a significant period of time, I worked overseas on 3-month secondments. So, basically living in a hotel and provided for by my employer. Now, the employer would provide a hotel, and they had a set of standards concerning fire safety, general safety, security, and certain standards where it was located, and so on and so forth. But they assumed that I would take myself to bed at a reasonable hour, that I'd be able to get up and organise myself and get to work, and really to look after those aspects, to travel around the town maybe, to use public transport and so on. With young people, with children in particular, it's a different kettle of fish altogether. So every aspect, the younger the child, I suppose, the more controls we need in place. But young children, by the very definition, are creative. We want them to be creative. We want them to be imaginative. We want them to be curious. Now that can lead to perhaps not being aware of the rules, not being aware of the environment, and just going into the wrong place, becoming engaging in too much risk. So with children, young people, and it's not just the youngest child. So as it progresses through that continuum of youth, maybe even up to the age of 25, but certainly in the UK up to the age of 18, where they are legally defined as children, there are certain aspects that we need to be aware of. With young children, as I mentioned, the accommodation would be a key feature. Whatever the activity might be, if it's a residential activity, then the accommodation will be a feature of whether it's safe. Are the children all together in the same place? Is there a leader in the same area? What are the protocols for nighttime supervision, and so on and so forth? So much more in depth than, fortunately, the position I was in when I worked overseas. Expanding on that, even with teenagers who may have a greater awareness of crossing the road or not talking to strangers, their imaginations may be, and if it's anything like mine at the age of sort of 16, 17, it really makes me cautious that they may be pushing the boundaries in certain respects that we as leaders, Julian mentioned the leadership, has to be aware of and has to have some sort of control over. So the responsibilities for young people, and it's all built into 31031, are much more intense, and it's a 24-hour responsibility, particularly for their physical safety, but also their mental well-being, the whatever aspects they might be exposed to, and so on and so forth. So it's a much more serious undertaking when we're working with young people and children.
Thank you so much, Mike. As you're both talking then, there are a few things that are kind of coming to mind, and you said that we, within the standard, age is defined up to 25. So there is a crossover then, obviously, with young adults working at that age as well, and potentially coming into the workforce from the age of 18, realistically, I guess, but certainly treated as adults in a workforce from 18 and following those different rules. And I think there's a piece that crosses over here quite nicely, which is where some organisations will struggle with this. Whereas actually, if you are an organisation having to protect youth in some way, you're going to have a completely different approach to it because we're now considering them adults in the workforce. But companies, especially young companies, will have a very social culture potentially as part of their organisation. They will be dealing with things that are sort of cultural differences. They will be dealing with just that kind of the fun of youth, the stuff that I'm sure I remember getting up to, but I'm not 100% sure if it was me now. And they'll be having the same challenges that those organisations will have. But there's this almost sort of sailor-fay attitude to it. Well, they're adults now and they should know better. And there are cases, unfortunately, where it's very difficult to find any duty of care cases because many things get settled out of court within the corporate sector. But there are cases where potentially the organisation has organised something, a party somewhere that's unsafe, and then there's this sort of lack of responsibility or duty of care to those people to get home. And they are what we would consider in this context still youth. So whilst a company may not have the same responsibility in a safeguarding manner, this is some of the questions that we're now beginning to ask because of 31/30 and because of the work that you've done in this space with 31. So it's important, and I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learnt across both, which is why I really wanted to kind of dive into this in a bit more detail. So let's consider that slightly older age group. So we understand the ramifications of keeping much younger children safe. We also completely appreciate that this is part of their education and we should actively be encouraging everyone to explore as much as they can of their environment and the world, and we want to do that because that's part of learning and development. When we get to this sort of teenage area, which is a little bit more difficult to manage, how does the standard support that? And the bit I'm particularly interested in, I guess, is the needs particularly of those students. So whether that be mental health needs, whether that be physical health needs, well, how does that help? Because I think there's some learnings there that companies can bring in because those same people have those same needs within their organisations and they're struggling with how to deal with some of that right now. So back over to you guys to shed some light on where you think the standard can support that.
If I may, I just want to take it more broadly at first. My colleagues have very good expertise, and I'm sure they'll bring a lot of into this question. The standard is as an overall mindset. It's not just series of sections. Oh, this is mitigation for accommodation. This is supervision. This is leadership. But it's unified in a more holistic approach. I would say two things about dealing with or preparing for dealing with more difficult or more challenging situations. Preparation and supervision. Preparation, the standard has a good section that we need to organizations need to make sure that they have a clear understanding of who are the stakeholders because that are involved and people and organizations are missing sometimes. So if you prepare and you have a good understanding of who are your stakeholders throughout the planning, the preparation, the planning, the execution, and the follow-ups of that trip, you will have outlined all the responsibilities and who to contact, who to talk to, who to consult, and so on and so on. And that will be very important. Understanding also who are your participants. So well-being, yes, but if you treat them all as equals, each participant has its specificity, special needs, what have you. So you need to prepare. Supervision, on the other hand, we have a big section on this. Both Julian and Mike have talked about this a little bit. Supervision is you can't just leave the kids or the young adults on their own and we're going to go to the pub. So we need to have clear outline of responsibilities, both in the trip, but also back at home at the organization that supports the trip from a distance. So we've outlined all those things, and I think the standard, and it's an international standard. So we wanted to have examples what could apply to the globe, I think we done a good job, and we cross-fertilize the expertise, and I think that could be a good benchmark to compare your policies or your standards or what have you, your practices against best practices from around the world.
And just leading on from that, and Joël mentioned stakeholders, I think one of the important things of the standard is that it explains to all stakeholders what their responsibilities are. So not just the leadership team or the provider, but also the participants. And you asked, Bex, how this fits with older teenagers, those in their early 20s. And it really has to be a partnership and an understanding that they, as a stakeholder, if they want to experience a particular activity that's being provided by the provider. So I deliver a lot of offshore sailing experiences with various groups of young people. It's a very risky environment. So anybody taking part in that activity has to accept that there are certain boundaries in order for them to get the best from that experience. And one of those is no alcohol for the whole of a week, maybe, even in their what might be called downtime, because the environment they return to is particularly dangerous. So it's not so much a rule as an understanding of the need for protocols. And then particularly parents of those under 18 need to be aware, because there are certain things they need to advise us of. And often parents don't want to disadvantage their children by disclosing, say, a particular illness or whatever. But it's really important because we don't want to prevent them taking part. We want to be able to cater for them so they can take part. So that's an important part of the partnership. So it's not just, stakeholders are not just passive beings. Everybody's involved. And to that extent, if a young person wants to take part in a let's call it a holiday or an activity that has a great deal of adventure and excitement, then there are certain boundaries. If they want to go to one of the, and I don't know the names of the places even, but one of the party islands and just sit on the beach and party in the evening, well, I think that's a different environment. But certainly when we take responsibility for young people, we all the stakeholders have a need to conform, I guess, and agree.
Once again, Mike, I think the synergy of understanding the stakeholders is so important, because when we represent that in an organisation perspective, again, we sort of treat people as though they are adults, but we forget that they have stakeholders associated to them as well, because they still have parents, potentially, or they have at least family, or even potentially minors that they're looking after. So they have people who are reliant on them. And we seem to have, again, this sort of challenge of, well, we can't tell people what to do. We can't tell people how to behave. No, you can't. But you can provide them and make them aware of the risks and make them part of that story so that they understand how it represents to them. And I think that's something really important that our listeners should take from the different, how these two standards can be used in conjunction. And Julian, I'm really, really keen to hear from you as well. So I just wanted to add that in. Please tell us your thoughts on this too.
I think there are some useful crossovers for a travel risk management professional who is working with an organisation that might be organising work travel for younger travellers. But I think it would actually be very difficult to apply 31031 to a work piece of travel for a number of reasons, because there's hardwired into 31031 a number of principles that wouldn't apply in a workplace setting, even if it's that workplace is travel related. And those sorts of principles are around that higher duty of care that a school or a youth or work organisation has for children. So that's hardwired in. Other things are that there's a distinct trip organiser, a distinct trip leader, and that supervision that Joël mentioned is throughout. But that doesn't really take place on a work trip in the same way. Also, that parents are involved. So normally, even a 20-year-old employee, they wouldn't be liaising with their parents or permissions relating to parents. And also another concept that's built firmly into 31031 is the concept of a third-party provider. a subcontractor, another organisation that is directly linked to the trip organizer. So the trip organizer can't subcontract responsibility to another organisation in the same way that it can be in other travel type settings. So I think there are some useful elements that for travel in general that could be looked at from early 31031, but it would be quite difficult to apply it.
I completely agree with you, because we're looking at a completely different subset, and it's not and different end users. So I'm 100% with you. I just feel that some of the things that you guys are already doing very well in this area, there will definitely be learnings that organisations.
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely some points of reference there,
but you definitely can't align your organisation with it, and I completely agree. Okay, guys. So look, I want to just use the rest of our time really helping those organisations who want to get more involved with the stand, who want to understand a bit more, the kind of golden nuggets or your top tips, if you like, as to whether that's applying the stand or getting involved or just understanding more about this. So, Joël, I'll start with you, and then Julian, and then we'll go to Mike.
Well, for sure, the preparation of the preparedness of an organization is critical. Sometimes people have a good document or feel they have a good document. Please avoid to cut and paste. On the internet, in artificial intelligence, you can get a lot of information, but if you don't customize your policies and your procedures, you're going to take a lot of risks. The other thing is, it's not just a piece of paper. It's a mindset. It has to be benchmarked against good practices, best practices, and it has to be tested before the trip. So training of staff and parents and other stakeholders, third-party providers, as Julian was saying, that needs to be tested. And the common terminology that we've developed in this will help organizations that have access to third-party providers that have the same understanding of what's at stake, no matter the age of the participants.
Yeah, I think if for a travel risk management professional who was keen to get involved with the standard, I think it would be a first point would be to really understand school trips and youth travel and understanding some of those differences. Of course, there are similarities, and we fit under the same family of standards, don't we? Because many of the principles apply. But I think having an understanding of school travel and the risks associated with children and young people when away from home would be really important to understand, to apply the standard to a safe trip.
Thank you, Julian. And Mike, before I move on, I will say that we've got a podcast coming out next month with a gentleman by the name of Brian Connon, and he again there's a from the travel service provider side, from the agent side, there's this crossover, isn't there? And this is what we talk a lot about when we talk about potential standards in the future for travel service providers, because whilst there are providers that provide specifically for school, there are also the same providers that provide across for everything. So he particularly is interesting, and he was jumping up and down when we did this particular episode with Joël and other things, because for him 31 is extremely important, because he's now, as an ex-security professional, he's now become a travel agent, and he's primarily going to be offering services to schools and colleges. And there are those experts within that field that do that piece there. But again, I would argue that the travel industry as a whole, and there is this crossover because it's about making money a lot within the industry. There's a lot to learn within this space. So That's part of why the work that we continue to do with ISO is where we're looking at both of these standards and how we can evolve the travel service providers across both to understand their responsibilities and their roles. So it's a really important journey that we all kind of go on together, and we keep going on together. Mike, finally, sorry, you'll please tell us your top tips and your golden nuggets.
Well, golden nuggets maybe. There's often a reluctance to engage with standards, rules. Why do I need rules? I'm doing this already, and why should I change my ways and so on? And I come from a generation where, when I was a child, we used to go out of the door just after breakfast and didn't come home till after dinner or at dinner time. And, what we got up to was nobody's business. Boating, walking, cycling, and we came home and fortunately safe. As time went on, we progressed, and the same individuals were still working together, but gradually got involved maybe with youth groups or cadet groups, and we started to discuss how we could make things better, make things safer. And then somebody at one stage said, do you know what? Before long, people are going to need qualifications to do this. So we sort of sat around the table in the pub and decided, well, we ought to perhaps be part of this, creating the standards, the rules, the qualifications. And it progressed from there. So it's been organic. And I think rather than objecting to those sorts of standards, my generation perhaps has a greater understanding of the confidence it brings. So 2 examples. I took a group to Nicaragua in 1999. All that time back, and we got stranded in El Salvador, which isn't a place you want to be stranded, but because of the structure and the framework we had and the support we had, it was safe and we were well managed. On another occasion, we spent 2 years working towards an expedition with 40 young people also and 10 adults in Tanzania, and a month before we were due to go, we were stopped. We were prevented from doing so for various reasons over the rules. And I was able to speak to a colleague in Kenya who was on the side of the Tana River running a rafting expedition. And I was able to explain to him what we required in terms of the activities, the safety management, and the outcomes, and the physical activities. And he said, yes, I can do that. And it's only because we had our protocols written according to then it was BS 8848, the British standard. He understood the standard. We operated to the standard, and he provided an expedition at 4 weeks' notice that was safe, worthwhile, and had all the positive outcomes. So I guess my top tip is don't be shy of the standards. Use them to your advantage and work with them, understand them, and ensure that all members of the group understand that too. And they'll be much safer.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, all of you, for this piece. I know when we first kind of talked about doing this recording beforehand, and we were sort of talking about some of the big differences, and I do feel strongly that there is just so much to be learned by looking at both and understanding. None of these standards are, as you've all pointed out, checklists that tell you what to do. What they are pathways for you to hold discussions and conversations and to benchmark your own practices against. And actually, any information that we can garner in this space, which will help us create programs that evolve, but primarily keep our people safe, be those youth, or be that within organisations who are now youth treated as adults, has got to be something that's really, really important. And that's why, to all of our listeners, we wanted to get this out there to really talk about 31 in a bit more detail, because if it's important for organisations, it's exceptionally important in this space. And what we have heard today is that there are lots of organisations already doing incredible things, and we know also within the educational sector specifically, more so leading than we're doing in the business sector. However, there are still a huge amount of people that need to know about this standard, that need to understand it, and we need to get it out there. So we have used our opportunity to do this via the Talk'n TRM podcast channel, and we hope that this will express more conversation from there. So finally, guys, just if people would like to understand more or get in touch, the working group itself is around for a little bit more now. Is that correct, Joël?
Yes.
But that will close soon because the standard's obviously been completed now. So what's the best way for people to find out more?
The best way would be to check iso.org and TC262. We'll put this in writing. TC262 is the technical committee managing risks, and there you'll have everything about ISO 31031. But if you Google ISO 31031, you'll find us.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Do you have, Mike and Julian, do you have any last words for our listeners before we let you go?
No, just to underscore the benefits of adventure and travel vastly outweigh the risk. So, and if this standard that Joël has helped champion can do that and get young people out there experiencing travel and adventure, then that's a great thing.
Yeah, I'll just echo Julian's words. It's absolutely worthwhile, and standards like this help support what we do. But ultimately, it's the experience for young people and the leadership team as well, to an extent, that's the most important thing.
Thank you so much, everybody. Okay, so we have been listening to an exclusive special episode of Talking TRM, the podcast, with my guests Joël Marier, Julian Penney, and Mike Blakey, all members of the working group that created ISO 31031, Managing Risk for Youth and School Travel. We'll be speaking to you soon, and in the meantime, please stay safe.